was rescued from the Los Banos internment camp. And prior to the war, I had been announcing on KZRM Radio Manila and KZRF Radio Filipinas for the Far Eastern Broadcasting Company, which did not pick up again after the war. Yeah, before the war, I worked for the Far Eastern Broadcasting Company, which had 2 commercial radio stations. There were 2 other commercial stations before the war, KZRH in the Heacock building, and KZIB in Ike Beck's department store. Ours were strictly just related to commercial broadcasting, without any affiliation to any particular store. We had KZRM Radio Manila and KZRF Radio Filipinas. And I think
Paul Smith?
Paul Lincoln Smith I was using, which is my full name. And our station break for KZRM, including chimes, went something like KZRM Radio Manila, bong, 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 bong. And the call letters for KZRF, when we gave the station break there, this is KZRF Radio Filipinas, bong, 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 bong. And then when the war broke out, and we combined the operation for lack of personnel, we made a combined station break, which I invented since I was doing most of the announcing. And we happened to be affiliated with CBS, and we're sending back the CBS correspondence over the air from our facilities. There was Bill Dunn and, I can't remember the lady's name. She was fine too, and we also did it for Mutual. But our combined station call in during the first month of the war there, before the Japanese occupied, took about 15 seconds, and it ran KZRM Radio Manila, bong, 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 and KZRF Radio Filipinas, bong, 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 bong. Far Eastern stations of the Columbia Broadcasting System, bong. And that was our wartime double station call.
I suppose people were really listening to this tape will sort of associate themselves with that.
Well, I suppose anybody that heard those stations before the war would recognize those calls.
So after, let's say, you saw the first raid in Nichols and
well, during the first, I think it was the first daylight raid, I had just been home because we had curfew at night, and I lived at the radio station. And usually the engineer that stayed overnight with me there was Tuason. And Tuason and I just would, after carrying on radio warfare with Tokyo for a while, starting at 11, would sack out, and then we'd get up in the morning and sign on at 6. And my first relief usually came in at about 9 o'clock. A Seventh-day Adventist missionary who had experience in Japan as well as in the Philippines, and later in the concentration camp he saved me from getting tortured. But he used to be on once a week with a half-hour devotional program before the war broke out. And he volunteered to come down and do a half-hour devotional daily. There were no more commercial broadcasts going on at the time. And so he was usually my first relief in the morning. And I'd run downstairs to a little restaurant and grab a plate of rice and some scrambled eggs and tomato ketchup. And that was usually my breakfast at that point in the game. And Reverend Paul Eldridge was the minister's name. And then when I went home once in a while in the daytime to visit, if someone else was there to do the announcing, I would visit my folks and then ride my bicycle back downtown again to the studio. And I had just left home when this first daylight raid came, and I was just about out in front of the Philippine General Hospital at the corner of Heran and Taft Avenue. I don't know the new street names, but I got off the bicycle and went into a little clump of trees on the front lawn of the hospital and laid the bicycle down and laid down beside it. And then I got to thinking as I was lying there, the Japanese were famous for bombing hospitals in China. Maybe this isn't such a hot place to be. So I got back on the bicycle and went tearing down the street. Now, about every 2 blocks there were civilian guard type people that were getting people off the street. But I had taken an old sign, KZRM, from an ancient ring stand for microphones, the old type carbon button mics. And I had mounted that on the front of my bicycle, and I'd simply point to the KZRM, and they'd wave me on. So I went tearing on down. Now, I had to cross the Quezon Bridge to Quezon Boulevard because our studios had moved to the Life Theater building by then. So when I got to that bridge, and the Japanese planes were still flying around, and I knew that bridges were often targets in their maneuvers, and I never pumped so hard on a bicycle before as I did going up the ramp to that long ramp to that bridge and across the bridge and tearing down the other side as fast as I could get to the station.
Meantime, you can hear the explosions going.
Yes, but it so happened at that point they were sticking pretty well to military targets because they did want to propagate their Asian co-prosperity sphere. And so they didn't want to antagonize the Filipinos any more than necessary. So they were doing a pretty good job of staying to military targets at the time.
Well, they're bombing Cavite at the same time.
Yeah, Cavite Naval Facility, and they were after, of course, Nichols Field. And I think there was, I forget what else they were working on at that point.
By then, they were sending a lot of soldiers were already being moved out from the city and moved into Bataan, right?
Of our forces, yes, I think so.
They're emptying the city now.
Although at that point, that wasn't very far into the war yet, so they hadn't all left yet. They left more or less toward the end of December, blowing up fuel dumps and ammo dumps that that were left. And they blew up our transmitters at Bulacan as they went north. And I was on the air at the time announcing. It was about 5 minutes after 12 noon. And I was doing a program, I believe that was the program that Cal Parrish used to do, a jazz program. He was involved in the Army, I think. And so I was imitating his style and doing that jazz program as best I could. And I was announcing, actually talking on the air at the time the transmitters were blown up, and the engineer signaled me that we were off the air. And as far as I knew, it was just probably because of another air raid coming, because we went off the air if there was any cloud cover, for sure. We'd go off the air in order not to provide a beacon homing device for the enemy planes, right? And
well, let's go back to the roundup. When the Japanese started coming in.
Okay.
And where were you? We're still in the city.
Yes, I was back at the mission compound. My father came and picked me up when he heard what was going on, and I left my bicycle and my little chest, and I had a favorite pipe and a few other things there that I left at the radio station and never went back. I didn't realize when he picked me up yet that that was going to be the last time I would see that radio station at that point. And the Japanese were rounding up the general American population along about the 4th and 5th of January. We were picked up in Malate. We were picked up on the 5th. There was a slightly interesting story there because One of the missionary families that lived right next to our house, the Bookers, Mrs. Booker was pretty well along in a pregnancy. And so when they picked up coming down Tennessee Street and picked them up, they left her. We didn't know that when they came along Wright Street and were picking us up.
Was that in the garbage trucks?
No. They were picking us up in cars. Mm-hmm. And on this particular occasion, I don't believe anyone in the group that was picking us up spoke much English, just a few words. And so we'd gathered up something to take along, and it told us we could take 2 bags if we wanted to. And so my mother came out with her hat on, and a hat pin through the hat and all that. And then she heard Louise Booker calling from across the fence over at their house, and she went to see what was going on, and Louise said, "They've taken Henry and the children and left me all alone." And so this, I think, because the Japanese had a high regard for old people and for babies and for pregnant women. And so they had left her in her home situation, but with nobody to care for her. And my mother came back around the walkway to our driveway and demonstrated that she planned to stay by removing the hat pin and the hat. And she said, "I must stay." And the Japanese, who had the most English, said, "Oh, no, you come. He said, "No, I must stay. You come." And she led him around the path around our house over to the fence where Louise Booker was. And when he saw her condition, he said, "Ah, so desu ka. You stay. And he let her stay to help take care of Louise Booker. He also let on one of the mission doctors who happened to be in the house next to ours on Wright Street, let him stay. So the 3 of them stayed on the mission compound. And the rest of us went out to Rizal Memorial Stadium and lined up in long lines to be processed. And then were taken to Santo Tomas.
Same day or the next day?
Same day. And then about, I don't remember the exact date, but about 10 days later, I think it was, around the middle of January, I heard one night that all the missionaries and their families must line up in front of the administration building at Santo Tomas at 9 o'clock the next morning. And I wondered, what's going on? Are they going to take us all out and shoot us or something, or what? And so I went around and said goodbye to all my friends, just in case. And we lined up the next morning at 9 o'clock out there, and we waited and waited and waited for several hours. Close to noon, I guess it was, they came out and announced, "All missionaries, go back to your mission compounds. Do your mission work, but don't have any contact with the Filipinos." Well, we heard the first part and ignored the second part. So they shipped us all out to our mission compounds. And so we were under house arrest, in effect, on the mission compound. We were supposedly allowed to go to market to buy food and had no money to buy the food with. We could exercise or whatever, but we weren't to just generally be free. So that created a problem. How are we going to feed ourselves? Fortunately, some Chinese businessmen who heard of our situation risked their lives to provide us with money to buy food. And in order to be fair to them, my father, who was head of the mission, kept a code book. And each time they would bring money, they would agree on a dollar value at that point, because inflation was just going like crazy. And if you did something to earn a little money one day, you'd better spend it the same day, or do some barter or whatever. So, so they'd agree on a dollar value for these businessmen to be recompensed after the war by the mission board. And that's how we managed to survive for quite a while.
How many were the missionaries? How many?
On our compound, on the Presbyterian compound in Manila, there were about 63 of us, including some who got stuck there in Manila in transit. They were on their way from China. And one of those families, the husband was still in China. The wife, Barbara Hayes, and her daughter Barbara, and son John Kelman McMillan Hayes, were among those that were repatriated during that period of house arrest. They were repatriated on the Grips home. But then eventually we were accused of being spies and saboteurs and all that sort of thing, back into camp. So they took us to Santo Tomas, but they wouldn't allow us any contact with the people that were in Santo Tomas at the time there. They kept us in little tents out on the front lawn. And then the next day, they took us to the railroad station, shipped us down to Los Banos. And they set aside a part of the camp in Los Banos and kept us separate for about 3 months. And during that 3-month period, that section of the camp got to be known jokingly by the main camp as the Holy City. Now, it was a very interesting experience because you had missionaries and their families there from many different denominations.
The
The Maryknoll sisters were there, the Jesuit priests. Those were a couple of the larger Roman Catholic groups. And I tell you, those Jesuit fathers were great workers. Well, some, but some were relatively slender. But they were among the best wood choppers. That when we went out on wood detail, they were strong. The wood that we were trying to split out there was still relatively green, trees just recently felled. And the axe would tend to just bounce off of it. And it took a very strong blow to penetrate that wood. And then we'd carry these big chunks of wood back in on our head. At least that's how I carried mine. Some carried on shoulders, but I just used the Filipino method and put it on my head and bounced along.
So is that what you did? I mean, what else did you do in camp?
Well, when we first went back in, I was assigned to be a breakfast cook. So we had these paddles about the size of a canoe paddle, a fat canoe paddle, and the big kawas about, I guess about 3 feet in diameter, were set in concrete blocks with a firebox underneath. And so the corn and rice were mixed and put into the boiling water, and you just stir that and stir it and stir it until it was cooked.
And then you had the line.
And then we served it up. The people lined up. And one of the interesting things about that Holy City experience, the main part of the camp had a jail. They had courts. Their canteen for food, which was brought by the Filipinos to the main gate, and we were allowed to purchase that and then resell it to those who had the means. In the main part of the camp, that had to be under lock and key, put in a cage and guarded. In the Holy City, one of the nuns and my father were in charge of the canteen. There was an empty barracks. The food was laid out on one of the long tables, and those who purchased. Anything that was left was simply left there till the next day at the canteen appointed time, and nobody would touch it. The whole thing, about disputes and so forth, it's not that anybody who's a missionary is necessarily immune from having a dispute now and then, but things were settled amicably without resort to things like courts and jails and things. So it was an interesting experience. And many of the missionaries learned to appreciate other denominations and other sects much more than they had before the war.
Was there a reason for keeping all the missionaries together and religious?
As far as I know, the only reason for keeping us segregated there at that point was to prevent news from coming in until it was old enough not to matter. And still, communications did take place. A friend of mine who died in concentration camp there at Los Banos, Bert Fonger, was the son of the American Bible Society folks there, the Fongers. And incidentally, Mrs. Fonger, Leith, was one of the few people that I've heard play a Hammond organ and make it sound pretty close to pipe organ. Not too many people have that capability. At any rate, Bert was one of the ones that was pushing, before we had our own kitchen established, pushing up a cart of food for us from the main kitchens. And at the little gate between the two compounds, these folks from the main camp would push the cart up there, and then some of us would push it on up the road and to where we had our food line. And Bert one time stood there with his hand on the handle of the cart and didn't step back from it like he normally would. And I looked at his face quizzically a little bit, and he just glanced down at his hand, and I got the message, literally. He had a message for me under his hand, so I just put my hand over his, and he withdrew his carefully, and I had the message covered. So there were ways of communicating even then. And then I crept through the tall grass one time to the fence between the two. It was just a swally fence. And I had noticed that when I picked up the cart with the food, that some of the kids were sitting with their back to the fence on the road that went up between the two camps. And so I kind of crawled through the grass and came up to the fence, and we had some conversations.
What about, let's go to the rescue a little bit, 11th Airborne. And of course you did, what, 3 years in Los Banos?
No, not 3 years in Los Banos. Altogether, we were prisoners for a little over 3 years. Yeah. But I don't remember exactly when we went back in and went to Los Banos. But we were out for a while, and I recall a little 4th of July celebration I had while we were still under house arrest. I had learned how to put a bunch of firecrackers together and make a little bomb out of it to make noise. And so I made up a couple of those. I still had some firecrackers in my desk. Made up a couple of those ahead of time for the 4th of July. Made some time fuse, which you can do by taking a piece of cotton string and soak it in a saturated solution of potassium nitrate. That provides the oxygen to keep it burning, but it burns slowly. And then after it's dry, you cut off a piece and time it. So then I timed how long did it take me to walk up to Taft Avenue, where the traffic was, and I prepared my time fuses in relation to that. Took these two bombs up there, put one in the drain on one side and one in the drain on the other side of the side street, and sat on the curb and waited, and started timing the traffic. And it took about, I don't remember the exact time, but it took about the same time that it took me to walk home and that I had set the time fuses for the traffic to come from the nearest rotunda. There were a couple of them down Taft Avenue, but from the nearest rotunda up to that corner took about that much time. So I waited until 3 truckloads of Japanese soldiers showed up at the rotunda down there, and I said, okay, here's the fun. Here comes my little celebration. And I lit the fuses, walked back to our house, got behind a bush at the corner, and watched. Just as the first truck came through the intersection, the first bomb went off down in the drain sewer, you know, where I'd put them, where they'd reverberate good. Blam! Screeching of brakes. Soldiers all wondering where this attack was coming from, and jumping out of their trucks ready to meet the attack. The second one went off. Blam! And they were They were going around searching and searching, found nothing, of course.
It's dangerous, isn't it? For you?
Oh, I suppose so, but I was a brash young fella and thought this would make a very good 4th of July celebration. I guess I was still about 17 or 18 at the time.
So you did see the rescue.
The rescue. Yes, I was part of the Internee Guard organization, and I was on guard duty at the woodpile or the camp gardens or wherever I got assigned from 3 to 5 in the morning with my shift.
So you were just getting off the shift.
So I got off at 5, and they had made an arrangement with the Japanese that those of us who had that 3 to 5 shift could simply sleep in, because we would have just gotten back to sleep about the time it was time for us to line up out in front for a head count. Yeah, 7 o'clock each morning, they went around and did a head count. We'd line up by 4s out in front of the barracks. And so I didn't have to go out. And I was still in the sack, and somebody hollered, "Parachutes!" And I think we had my roommate and I had put our beds up just a little over head high and extended the division of walls between the cubicles up to give us a little privacy up there, and so we wouldn't be staring down on someone else. And that left us a little room down below to have a classroom. We managed to get something to use for a blackboard. And so we had a Dutch father that was teaching us radio, and a couple of the Seventh-day Adventist missionaries who were surgeons, husband and wife team. The husband was teaching some anatomy, and so...
What's his name?
Let's see, his name, Dr. Honor. And I don't remember the name of the Dutch father that was teaching us the radio course. And then one of our missionaries who was a teacher at the Union Theological Seminary in Manila was teaching a logic course. But no matter how we started out in the logic course, whatever the topic was, syllogisms or whatever, we always finished up talking about food somehow. And of course, you know, you don't have to wonder too much about why. But then when the call came that parachutes were there, I think I hit the ladder once on the way down and looked out the side door that we'd made from our cubicle, and the sky was just, you know, full of these what looked like long boxes coming down under parachutes. And of course, I guess most of it was the paratroopers and probably some equipment in boxes. But I ran back inside, grabbed my yellow armband, and went tearing up the hall to where my captain was, and I said, "What's my assignment?" And he said, "You go up to barracks 26 and 27 and make sure they stay inside." Problem. 26, where the Protestant chapel was in the back, and 27, where the Roman Catholic chapel was in the back, were separated by a big space where 3 barracks had blown down in a typhoon. So I kind of doubted whether I'd have time to get to both of them physically. But having a rather strong voice, I went tearing out. I went over to barracks 17. I was living in 16. Out through 23, the back half of which was auxiliary hospital. Went up to the road where I could see and cupped my hands and just yelled at the people out in front of 26. Get down, get back inside, and yelled the same thing for barracks 27, and I just kept alternately yelling at one and the other.
That's probably why there were very little people.
Until finally they retreated. Then I went back into 23, told the people that were lying in beds there, stay in their beds. It's probably just as safe as anything else you could do. Don't try to get up or get on the floor. And then the front half was men's barracks, and I said, everybody better hit the deck, because things had broken loose by then. And and I realized as the fighting was going on that what I thought was just kind of fancy sound effects in old Western movies, you know, where you'd hear a bullet hit a rock and sing, it does. they do sing. And one guy started poking his head out to see what was going on and almost got it shot. And so I said, you better stay down. And so we just lay there until there was a lull. I thought I'd go back to, from 23 back to 17 and see how they were doing. And I had my hands on the doorposts, ready to shove off across, because I had to cross a road to get to the next set of barracks.
Soldiers, American soldiers?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. Most of it so far was either around the perimeter or at down at the barracks where the Japanese were doing their setting up exercises. Yeah. So they got attacked while their guns were still in the gun racks.
So were they? So they were dead. They were shot.
Well, I couldn't see that part. There were too many barracks in between at that point. But just as I was about to shove off, I turned my head over my shoulder to the men in the barracks, and I said, if the fighting starts again, you know what to do. Hit the deck. And I tensed my muscles and about to take off, and everything broke loose again. So I said, here we go, and just hit the deck. Then a fellow who had been on the previous internee guard group and had been in and out of the camp a few times with intelligence that helped to get the word back what was needed. I don't remember his name.
Okay.
He...
Filipino?
No, an American. But he had close contact with the guerrillas and also got intelligence word back to the command. And so they knew, for instance, that too many of us would be too weak to follow their number one plan, which was to have us open a corridor and walk down the beach past the enemy lines. And we were about 10 miles behind the lines still. So they brought down these Amtraks from Lingayen, where their landing had been up there. At any rate, he came through and he said, okay, we got the camp secured. Tell everybody, grab what you can carry and let's go down to the lake. So I spread that word and got back to my things and put on a couple of extra layers of clothes.
Do you remember anyone, like an officer's name that was stand quite prominent to?
No, I don't.
Okay.
There may be others who would be more savvy about that sort of thing.
So you piled in the Amtrak?
Not yet. We had to walk down to the lake.
Oh, the lake.
Anybody that could walk that far walked. Carry what you can carry. So I took...
Amtraks did come into the camp.
They sent up, I think, one or two to pick up the people who weren't able to walk.
Okay.
And a doctor in his Jeep came along, and he picked up my mother, who wouldn't be able to walk that much. In fact,
you all walked?
Then we all went down to the lake. I was carrying my box of tools, which was what almost got me tortured, because in my box of tools was a little green jewel light that had come out of some kind of a piece of equipment, and I'm a pack rat. I save everything. And when the Japanese were inspecting, looking for a shortwave radio, they found that little jewel light, and they thought, I must have it. And this is the time when Paul Eldridge came to my rescue, because he spoke fluent Japanese, having been a missionary in Japan for a while. And he explained to them over and over that I had been the camp electrician for the Holy City, and that's why I had all this kind of stuff, you know, and had electrical wire and whatnot in my cubicle. So anyway, we went down to the lake, and I heard that the P-38s and the auxiliary units from the airborne that were helping to hold away the soldiers from the front lines or from backup positions to keep our corridor open would be able to hold that corridor for 7 hours for the rescue. And the P-38s were overhead doing this job from the sky while the others were doing their thing on the ground. And we were lining up by 50s down there. Incidentally, my tools got too heavy. I wouldn't have made it with those tools. So I put them in the Jeep that came by with my mother and the doctor. And they took them on down. When I got down there, I found out that some of the guys in the rear guard in the 3 Amtraks that were doing the rear guard action was just going to wait till we all got on board. And they'd all gone. They had to come back again and make a second trip, a lot of them. Some of them had broken down out in the lake. And one of the guys said, I've got to try to fix those ones that are broken down, but I don't have enough tools. I said, you take my tools. God bless, and thank you for a rescue. And so I had the clothes on my back, my Bible, and my Testament, my New Testament. And meantime, we were eating coconuts and bananas that friendly people had given us on the way down. And
So after you crossed the lake, where you got...
Well, then we waited in groups of 50 for the Amtraks to come back. I was in the last group down there, and the Japanese were shooting mortar shells at us. Fortunately, our P-38s used their heads, and they circled way down the beach beyond us, and the mortar shells were all falling way down there. And so then the Amtraks came back again. I was the last civilian to get on board the last Amtrak, except for the 3 rear guard, at, I think it was either 5 minutes of 2 or 5 minutes after 2, which was just 7 hours from the 7 o'clock jump.
Wow.
So the timing, everything worked out perfectly. What I heard was that we lost a lieutenant on one of the Amtraks to a sniper in a coconut tree, and that there were some minor things like sprained ankles and stuff in the jump. But that lieutenant and 2 guerrillas were the only ones killed in that action, which was very amazing. They had expected heavy casualties. They had not expected to get more than maybe half of us out alive. But every internee who was alive at the beginning of the rescue was alive and rescued. Amazing feat, an amazing feat, like a miracle.
Yeah.
I had an interesting experience while under house arrest. My parents were missionaries for 43 years in the Philippines. And so when we were kicked out of Santo Tomas to go back to the mission compounds, we were on the mission compound in Manila. And we had shell tennis courts, and we built a volleyball court on the compound. There were 63 of us there on that compound. At one point, a very good friend of mine, Reuben Shea, who had been very active in Boy Scouts in the Philippines, decided that it would be a good idea to establish an underground scout troop there on the mission compound. So I worked with him on that, and in the process of working for various merit badges for physical development, we had to do rope climbing. So we had set up a rope in one of the trees, and it was not far from the fence that divided the old mission high school from the rest of the compound. The Japanese had taken that over as an auxiliary hospital. And there was an old fellow there standing at the fence watching me do the rope climbing. And when I came down, he beckoned me to come over to him, which I did. And a very interesting situation developed. He said, "How old are you?" And I said, "I'm 18. And he said, "Oh, me think you much older. Me think you 21. I said, "No, I'm 18. I had a full beard, as I do now, but it was a little blacker, and I had a little hair on top of the head, although the forehead was already starting to recede a bit." And he said, "Oh, hard to believe. Me think you 21. I said, "No, I'm 18. And then he said, "How old do you think I?" And I hadn't the foggiest how to guess his age. His head was shaved bald, and there was no hair to look at, and I've never been good at guessing ages on Oriental people anyway. They're very difficult because they don't usually turn gray like we do as easily. And so I just thought, rather than chance offending him in some way, I would simply refuse to guess. He kept insisting for a while, and I kept refusing, saying that I'm not good at guessing people's ages, so I have no idea. Well, he never did tell me how old he was, but the conversation that followed was very interesting. He said, "You know, me very old soldier, fight in many war, fight in Manchuria, fight in Korea, fight in China, now fight in Philippines." About that time we could hear the big guns booming across the waters from Corregidor and Bataan, which had already fallen. And he turned, and we heard the guns booming right then. And he turned back and he said, "You know, in Bataan, many soldiers died, many Filipino soldiers, many American soldiers, many Japanese soldiers. I sorry." Now here was a fellow that you would think through all those wars would have gotten quite calloused about killing, about war, about people dying, but very much a human being to the core. I sorry. And that was very impressive to me about humanity, about people's values in whatever culture they come from. And it also made very clear that it was not fair to judge any group of people by what a few people might do. Thank you.